Hello and welcome, and ladies and gentlemen, man was never an accident. From the very beginning, God created man with a purpose, with intention, and with a divine plan in mind. When we look at Genesis 1:26-28, we see that God made man in his image, setting him apart from all other creation. That means we carry something sacred within us, something that reflects the very nature of God. We weren't just placed here to exist. We were placed here to rule, to build, to cultivate, and to represent God's authority on earth. Now, that's a weighty responsibility, isn't it? But here's the beauty of it. God didn't just give man dominion and then leave him to figure it all out alone. He equipped us with everything we need: wisdom, strength, and a heart designed for relationship with him. He gave Adam the responsibility of naming the animals, caring for the Garden of Eden, and walking in daily communion with him. And that hasn't changed. Every single one of us has a divine assignment. Some are called to lead, others to teach, others to serve, but all of us are called to live with purpose. The problem is, too many of us are walking around without knowing why we're here. We chase success, power, and recognition, but none of that can truly satisfy the soul. We see men striving, working tirelessly to build wealth, status, and influence, but at the end of the day, they still feel empty. That's because fulfillment doesn't come from what we achieve. It comes from living out God's purpose for our lives. See, the enemy wants us distracted. He wants us to believe that we're here by chance, that we're just another person trying to make it through life. But God says otherwise. He says, "I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope." Jeremiah 29:11. And so, the question we must ask ourselves is, are we living in alignment with God's purpose? Are we walking in the authority he gave us? Or are we drifting, letting life happen to us instead of stepping into the role he designed for us? Purpose isn't something we find in the world. It's something we discover in God. When we seek him, when we walk in obedience, when we commit ourselves to his will, suddenly everything begins to make sense. God placed us here to be builders, protectors, and leaders, not just in our own lives, but in our families, communities, and beyond. We are meant to be the reflection of his glory on earth, to bring light into dark places, and to stand firm in our faith. And when a man understands that, when he truly grasps that he was created with divine intention, he becomes unstoppable. He no longer wanders. He walks with purpose. He no longer doubts. He moves with confidence. He no longer hesitates. He steps forward in faith. Because a man who knows why he was created is a man who cannot be shaken. God didn't just place man on this earth to exist. He gave him responsibility. From the very beginning, he entrusted man with the task of stewardship, of managing what had been created, of ensuring that things flourished under his care. That means nothing in our lives truly belongs to us. Our families, our resources, our time, our gifts, everything we have is something God has placed in our hands, and he expects us to handle it well. But here's the issue. Too often, we take ownership instead of stewardship. We start believing that what we have is ours alone, that we can do with it whatever we please. We forget that we are merely caretakers, not the owners. When God gave Adam the garden, he didn't tell him to do whatever he wanted with it. He told him to tend it, to cultivate it, to guard it, to guard it. That's the same command given to us. Whether it's our relationships, our careers, or our influence, we are called to manage everything in a way that honors God. Think about it. When something is entrusted to you, there's an expectation that you will take care of it. If someone hands you their home to watch over while they're away, you don't let it fall apart. You don't neglect it. You protect it, maintain it, and ensure that when they return, it's in good condition. That's exactly how we should treat the things God has placed in our hands. Our children are not just ours to raise. They are souls entrusted to us to guide in the ways of the Lord. Our finances are not just for our comfort. They are resources meant to be used wisely and generously. Our influence is not just for our gain. It is a tool to uplift and lead others toward truth. The problem is, many of us neglect this role. We get distracted, we get comfortable, or we get selfish. We start living for ourselves, doing only what benefits us in the moment. But what happens when a man fails to be a good steward? Things start to break down. Families fall apart when men refuse to lead spiritually. Communities suffer when men ignore their responsibility to stand for righteousness. The world becomes darker when men fail to guard what God has given them. And make no mistake, there will come a time when we have to give an account. God will ask us what we did with what He placed in our care. Did we protect it? Did we nurture it? Did we invest in it? Or did we squander it? That's why this role isn't something we take lightly. A man who understands stewardship walks differently. He's intentional with his time, careful with his words, and mindful of his influence. He doesn't waste what he's been given, and he doesn't take it for granted, because at the end of the day, real men don't just take, they build, they protect, and they leave behind something greater than themselves. Leadership is not about position, it's about responsibility. And as men, we have been called to lead, not with pride, not with dominance, but with wisdom, humility, and faithfulness. God has given us the role of spiritual leadership, not just in our own lives, but in our homes, our churches, and our communities. And when a man refuses to lead, when he steps back instead of stepping up, things begin to fall apart. Look at the world today. Families are breaking down, communities are lost, and too many people are wandering without direction. Why? Because men have abandoned their post. God designed us to be pillars, to be strong in faith, to be the ones who guide, protect, and stand firm when everything else is shaking. But too often, we sit back, we stay silent, we wait for someone else to do what God has already called us to do. Real leadership isn't about control, it's about example. A man doesn't have to demand respect when he lives in a way that earns it. His family follows him not because he forces them to, but because they see his integrity. His community listens to him not because he shouts the loudest, but because his life speaks louder than words. That's the kind of leadership God calls us to. When Paul wrote to the church, he told them that a leader must be above reproach, faithful, self-controlled, and strong in character. That's not a suggestion, that's a requirement. And if we as men are going to take up our role, we need to start with ourselves. A man can't lead others if he isn't first led by God. You can't pour into your family if your own cup is empty. You can't guide your children if you're lost yourself. You can't speak wisdom if you haven't sought it. That's why a real leader spends time in prayer. He knows he doesn't have all the answers, but he serves the one who does. He doesn't move on impulse. He moves in faith. He doesn't follow the crowd. He follows Christ. And make no mistake, leadership comes with responsibility. If God has placed people in your life to guide, then you are accountable for how you lead them. Are you pointing them toward truth, or are you leading them astray? Are you standing for what is right, even when it's hard? Are you leading in love, or are you leading in selfishness? Because whether we accept it or not, people are watching. Our children are watching, our families are watching, our communities are watching, and when a man steps into his God-given role as a leader, he changes the atmosphere. Because a man who leads with faith, who walks with integrity, who stands firm in truth, that is a man who builds something that will last for generations. Obedience is not a suggestion. It's the foundation of a life that honors God. Too often we treat faith like an accessory, something we wear when it's convenient. But real faith requires action. The Bible makes it clear faith without works is dead. That means it's not enough to believe in God. We have to walk in obedience to His word. We have to live in a way that reflects what we claim to believe. But let's be honest, obedience isn't always easy. It's easy to trust God when everything is going well, when the path is clear, when the road is smooth. But what happens when the storm comes? What happens when the situation doesn't make sense? When the world is pressuring us to go in one direction, but God is calling us to another? That's where true faith is tested. And too many men give up when things get hard. They compromise, they take shortcuts, they justify choices that go against God's will because it's easier in the moment. But obedience isn't about convenience, it's about commitment. Look at the men in the Bible who walked in obedience. Noah built the ark before a single drop of rain fell. Abraham left everything he knew to follow God's promise. Daniel prayed when it could have cost him his life. These men didn't wait for proof before they obeyed. They obeyed because they trusted God. And that's what faith looks like. It's not just believing that God can do something, it's trusting Him enough to obey even when we don't see the outcome. Obedience isn't just about the big moments, it's about the daily choices we make. It's about how we handle our relationships, how we conduct ourselves at work, how we raise our children, how we treat people when no one is watching. It's about standing firm in our values, even when the world tries to shake us. And make no mistake, the world will test you. It will try to convince you that obedience to God is outdated, that his commands are too restrictive, that you can do things your own way. But every time we step outside of God's will, we pay a price. Disobedience always comes with consequences, broken relationships, lost opportunities, unnecessary struggles. But when a man walks in obedience, he walks in blessing. He walks in peace, he walks in purpose. And here's the truth. A man who obeys God is a man who cannot be moved. He doesn't chase validation from the world because he knows where his approval comes from. He doesn't compromise because he knows who he belongs to. He doesn't hesitate when God calls because he knows that obedience is the key to unlocking everything God has planned for his life. Because at the end of the day, obedience isn't about rules, it's about trust. And a man who truly trusts God follows him without hesitation. The world tells us that strength is about power, about being in control, about making sure we're always on top. But God's definition of strength looks different. It's not found in how much authority we have, how much money we make, or how many people respect us. True strength is found in serving. It's found in humility. It's found in putting others before ourselves, just like Jesus did. Look at his life. Look at his life. He was the Son of God, yet he washed the feet of his disciples. He had all the authority in heaven and on earth, yet he chose to serve rather than to be served. He could have come with an army, with power, with force, but instead, he came with love. And he showed us that real leadership, real greatness, comes from serving others. That's the kind of man God calls us to be. Men who don't lead with ego, but with sacrifice. Men who don't seek status, but seek to make a difference. Men who don't just talk about love, but demonstrate it through action. The greatest leaders are always the greatest servants. In our homes, that means being present, being patient, and being willing to do the little things that show our families we care. In our communities, it means standing up for what's right, helping those in need, and using what God has given us to bless others. In every area of life, it means choosing humility over pride, choosing love over selfishness, choosing to lift others up rather than always trying to lift ourselves higher. But let's be honest, serving isn't always easy. Sometimes it feels like we're giving, and no one even notices. Sometimes it feels like humility is weakness, like we're losing instead of winning. But that's the lie the world wants us to believe. Because the truth is, when we serve, we reflect the very heart of God. When we love unconditionally, when we put others first, when we choose humility over recognition, we step into the kind of strength that nothing can shake. And let's not forget, God sees everything. He sees the moments when we sacrifice. He sees the times when we do the right thing, even when no one is watching. He sees the way we care for our families, the way we help a stranger, the way we give without expecting anything in return. And he honors that. So if you want to be a man of impact, a man of strength, a man who leaves behind a legacy, start by serving. Serve your family, serve your church, serve the people God places in your life. Because a man who serves with love, a man who leads with humility, a man who puts others before himself, that's the kind of man who changes the world. God didn't place us here just to live for ourselves. He didn't bless us, strengthen us, and guide us so we could keep it all to ourselves. We were created for more than just personal success. We were created to advance his kingdom. That means everything we do, everything we build, everything we pour our time and energy into should have a purpose beyond us. It should point people back to God. It should bring light into dark places. It should leave the world better than we found it. But too many men have settled for less. Too many have gotten comfortable just getting by, just taking care of themselves, just making sure their needs are met. But God's call is bigger than that. Will you? When Jesus gave the Great Commission, he didn't say, "Go and live a good life and mind your own business." He said, "Go and make disciples of all nations." That means we have work to do. That means every one of us has a role to play in bringing more people into God's kingdom. And no, that doesn't mean you have to be a preacher or stand behind a pulpit. It means that wherever God has placed you, you represent him. In your home, you lead your family in faith. In your workplace, you carry yourself with integrity and grace. In your friendships, you encourage, you uplift. You point people toward truth. Every moment, every interaction, every opportunity is a chance to show the love of God. Because the way you live, the way you love, the way you serve, that's your greatest testimony. But let's be real. The world is full of distractions. It's easy to lose focus, to get caught up in our own plans, to push the things of God to the side. That's why we have to be intentional. We have to wake up every day and ask ourselves, am I living for something greater than myself? Am I using my gifts to build God's kingdom, or am I just building my own? Because at the end of the day, everything we build for ourselves will fade. Money fades. Fame fades. Even the greatest accomplishments will one day be forgotten. But the impact we make for God, that lasts forever. And here's the truth. When a man chooses to live with that kind of purpose, he becomes unstoppable. Because a man who is focused on God's kingdom doesn't waste time chasing things that don't matter. He doesn't get distracted by the temporary. He doesn't settle for just existing. He builds, he uplifts, he pours into others, he walks in faith. Because at the end of this life, the only thing that will truly matter is whether we did what God put us here to do. And a man who understands that, a man who lives for something bigger than himself, that's a man who leaves behind a legacy that will never be forgotten. At the heart of it all, the role of man in God's kingdom is about purpose, responsibility, and faithfulness. We were created with intention, not to drift through life aimlessly, but to walk in the authority God has given us. We are called to be stewards, not just of material things, but of our families, our gifts, and our influence. We are called to lead, not with pride, but with humility, with wisdom, with a deep commitment to truth. And none of that is possible without obedience. When we choose to walk in God's will, when we trust His plan more than our own desires, we step into the kind of life we were truly meant to live. But leadership and obedience mean nothing without love. The greatest strength a man can have is found in serving others, in putting their needs above his own, in reflecting the love of Christ in everything he does. That is how we build God's kingdom, not just through words, but through action. And when a man commits himself to that kind of purpose, when he dedicates his life to something greater than himself, he leaves behind more than a legacy. He leaves behind a testimony that will echo for generations.